Got that? If the Supreme Court or whatever appellate court agrees with the decision below, here's the fancy word that you use. It was also used to describe a horse that was a Triple Crown winner. Affirmed. If the Supreme Court says affirmed, that means the previous decision was the one that was there. Okay? Affirmed. The previous decision, the one that was appealed up, is like, yeah, these guys got it right. We affirm. Yeah. Uh-huh. I did. It's okay. That's why I try to say it multiple ways so that you get it. Yeah. If they don't, they would say it's reversed. That's an easier one to understand. Okay? Affirmed, reversed. Let me see how far we want to get. Yeah. Oh, let's get into this one. Judicial restraint versus judicial activism. I know we're kind of bouncing around a little bit here in this latter part of the notes. Do you see where we are? I did jump ahead to majority opinion, concurring opinion, dissenting opinion, reversed, and affirmed. Let's double back to what's going to ultimately be a huge, huge, huge thing. Judicial activism and judicial restraint. I want you to really lock in on this one because I'm going to be asking you, where are you coming from? What do you think is the good way to look at the Constitution? What do you think is the better way to look? Don't look at all? Just go flip, you know? Justice is supposed to be blind, but, you know, automobile drivers are not. And Supreme Court justices should also, and they do, they bring in the way they look at things. We're going to call judicial activism and judicial restraint. And probably what you're going to hear me say is judicial activism is sometimes referred to as liberal. Although there is a way to be more conservative with judicial activism, but lately judicial activism is a little bit more of a liberal approach. Judicial restraint is going to be a little bit more of a conservative approach. Over the last 20, 30 years, Republicans are going to tend to approve of a judicial restraint approach on certain things. Democrats maybe approve a little bit more of a judicial activism approach. Just to kind of lay it out there a little bit. But, you know, one person's like, well, I'm going to be a little bit more active in here, and we're going to completely flip it over, and it's going to come out the way, anyway. Let's give a little bit of background here. Let's start with the way that justices, particularly Supreme Court justices, looked at the Constitution and the laws passed by Congress and the President for most of the, I don't know, the first 150 years of the country. Write it down. Judicial restraint was the way for most of the first 150 or so years of the country's history. Okay? And there's different component parts to judicial restraint. One component is, are you ready? Because there's different components. And some of you guys might like this, or you might call it a little bit of a mix, or you might like go, they both actually have some good sense. And I want to phrase them in the most positive way for either side. Judicial restraint says this. We're the justices. We didn't write the Constitution. The people who wrote the Constitution, we want to look at the way they wrote it at the time they wrote it. Original language. Write that down. The way it was written originally. The original intent of the people who wrote it. Well, when was the Constitution written? A long time ago, yeah. I mean, in the late 1700s. Now, there are some parts of the Constitution you can look at and go, what was the original intent of, you know, the 26th Amendment? Well, what year should we look at for the original intent of the 26th Amendment? Yeah, the 1960s, you know, when we got the voting right for 18-year-olds. But a lot of those, when you go the original Constitution or the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, that's going way back, well over 200 years ago. You got that? Here's another component of judicial restraint. Let's not read between the lines. Let's not add any words that aren't already there. And part of the thinking is, look, if we start adding words to, if we think that there should be words added to it, whose job is it to add words to the Constitution? 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the state. Now, that can be very unnerving at times Because is it hard to add words to the Constitution? Yeah. It's only been amended 27 times. It's really, really hard. Critics would say, oh, it's too easy to add words because once you add words, they're in there. Once the Supreme Court says the words are there, they're there. And to get rid of the words the Supreme Court has added and interpreted, you have to amend the Constitution or get the Supreme Court to change its mind. Judicial restraint would also say this. Write this down. We defer to Congress and the President, the elected branches of office. We defer to their judgment. They stand before the people. They stand before elections. They have big staff. They have a lot of input. We're just 9 people on the Supreme Court with robes and 2 or 3 clerks and a secretary and somebody who comes in and cleans our office every few days. I mean, it's a relatively small staff. Yeah, we have all these lawyers and telling us what way to go, but it's like judicial restraint would go, let's just rely more on the elected people. Like on the issue of what should we do about Japanese Americans who have been moved into confinement during the beginning stages of World War II? The Supreme Court was like, it's not for us to decide what the national security concerns of the country are. If the President says it's a national security thing and Congress says it's a national security thing, we're going to defer. Judicial restraint. Okay? Does that make sense? Let's see some other things. Yeah, the court don't make the law. They're very sensitive to like making the law in the image of their own opinions. You got that? Original intent of the founders. The other 2 branches should solve the other things. Okay? Yeah, good. Okay? Judicial restraint. Don't add to it. The other philosophy is judicial activism. And that has been much more so the case in the last 60-ish years. Judicial activism. Judicial activism says the Constitution is not just an old document that is dead on arrival. It is a living document that moves and grows with the times and changes and technology. One example they would give is like, the Fourth Amendment, the right to be protected against seizure by the government and your papers, houses, and effects or something like that. Well, what about your computer database? Do you have to amend the Constitution to include the computer database to make that relevant and so forth? Judicial activism people are like, go with what is a reasonable flow of interpreting the Constitution. Okay? Go with the flow. Make it work. The Constitution is a living document. Okay? And don't be afraid to step in and do what is right. If doing what is right fits arguably into the words and framework of the Constitution. Now, as we go case by case by case, sometimes you're going to see judicial restraint people are going, excuse me, what did you just write? How does that have anything to do with original words and so forth? And the judicial activists are like, no, this is what is right in this particular situation. And by the way, who's right? Whoever has the majority. Oh. Now this complicates things a little bit. You ready? Following precedent. This is a very important component part. Following precedent. There's a Latin phrase for it and basically means the same thing. Stare decisis. If you hear this, that basically translates to let the decision stand. So, I'll give you an example. If the Supreme Court has ruled a certain way on some issue, later Supreme Courts will look at that and go, it's already decided. We want consistency and regularity and predictability in the law, especially the highest law of the country, the Constitution. So if the Supreme Court has already looked at this issue, we should be very hesitant to look at this issue again and come up with something different. But I'll give you one clear example of where the Supreme Court said, no, we're not going to follow precedent. This was a case that came up at the end of last year in the 9th grade. Slaves were freed. They'd just been able to start voting, and mixing into Southern society when it all kind of started falling apart, right? And segregation came in, and Southern states were starting to set up segregated public schools and segregated transportation and all kinds of things. And somebody came in and said, hey, that's a violation of my 14th Amendment right to equal protection. The Constitution says you can't treat me differently on the basis of the color of my skin. What did the Supreme Court rule? The case was Plessy versus Ferguson. You're going to learn that as part of this unit. The case was Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court said all white guys being very judicially restrained. Perhaps some people would say they're just being very political, and they're looking and going, wow, do we really want to tell the Deep South that they can't do what they want to do if 2/3 of them are white and they're kind of in charge of the situation? They said separate but equal is okay. You got that? They said that segregated schools were okay. That was in the late 1800s. African Americans and people who were opposed to that were like constantly trying to get the Supreme Court to change its mind and not follow precedent. Did they ever get the Supreme Court to change its mind and not follow precedent? Yep. And it came in the 1950s. The case was Brown versus Board of Education. It's one of the most famous Supreme Court decisions. It was a 9-0 decision. And the Supreme Court said, we changed our mind. That previous decision that was written and all the ones that follow that was wrong. We changed our mind. You got that? Will the Supreme Court change its mind on the issue of abortion in Roe versus Wade? I don't know. But there's a lot of people watching very carefully because numbers matter. The critics of Roe versus Wade say that decision was too judicially active. There's nothing in the Constitution about abortion or female pregnancy or anything like that. If people wanted to add that to the Constitution, let them amend it. But the Supreme Court said, no, we find that in the Constitution. Will the opponents of that decision follow precedent? Or if they've got the numbers, it just takes 5, will they reverse it? We'll find out. I want you to start thinking about that, because as we get a little bit closer to that issue, I'm going to have you guys jump in and chime in to what you think. In fact, actually, right now, how many of you guys, this is a good point to just sort of check this, raise your hand if, just based on what you've heard so far, you think judicial restraint is a little bit closer to maybe how you would look at the Constitution. Stick to the words of the Constitution, original intent. Let's see those hands. We got 2 over here, maybe. That's a pencil. Does that count as a vote? Sort of over here, maybe-ish. All right. Some of you guys are like, I'm kind of waiting to hear some more argument. How many of you guys would say judicial activism is maybe a little bit closer to where you're coming from? Good. We got a nice split here. We're going to have some good discussions and so forth. And again, it kind of sometimes depends on the case. Well, we got the RGB group right over here. Is that it? Yeah, RGB would be more of a judicial activist, okay? In fact, let's get into the justices of the Supreme Court, okay? John Marshall, write his name down. John Marshall, this is good. John Marshall was the very first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He served from 1801 until 1835. He is going to be very, very important. He was one of 3 on the Supreme Court back in those days because it was a smaller court. They didn't have as many cases. And he was very influential. If you can give credit to the power of the Supreme Court in the United States of America, you're going to give a lot of it to that guy. Because he was the first guy that came into that position and said, we're going to take the power. And understand this. There's a lot of democracies in the world, particularly like over in Europe and some other parts. They do not all have court systems that have as much power as our court system. Do you understand that? In fact, I would say I haven't come across a country yet that has a group of people like our Supreme Court that is as powerful as our Supreme Court is. And when I mean powerful, if you want to disagree with the Supreme Court, good luck with that. Because you can't quickly change their membership. They're in there for life. And you can't fire them. And if you want to change the opinion, you either got to persuade them, good luck with that, to change their mind, or amend the Constitution. And that's not easy to do, is it? It's very, very hard. John Marshall, let's give you the case that really got it set. Judicial review, the case is called, you see that right there? Marbury versus Madison, 1803. This is really, really early. And it establishes the principle of judicial review. It is empathetically the province and duty of the judicial department to say what the law is. Huh? In other words, we're the Supreme Court, we're the judicial branch, we're the highest court, we say what the Constitution is. You might have an opinion, President or Congress, but you know what? Your opinion is your opinion. Our opinion is the final law. Whoa! Where did they come up with that? Well, in the case of Marbury versus Madison, that's how they interpreted the Constitution. And that's how they interpreted the facts. And the irony was, the person who might disagree with that, Thomas Jefferson, he wasn't going to disagree with that particular opinion because he won the case. It was one of those things where it's like you think you win, but in fact, the way things look when you ultimately look at the scenario, you have lost. Those of you guys who are fans of Hamilton will know Thomas Jefferson was on the opposite side of the Federalists, including Hamilton and Adams and those guys. Well, Adams lost, and Jefferson was about to come to power, and Adams had appointed some Federalist positions to the federal government. Some of them hadn't quite gotten their paperwork all filed in, and when Jefferson came into office, he's like, I'm not going to go through with that. So Marbury, one of the guys that was didn't get his job that he was supposed to because the paperwork was late, he filed a lawsuit. It was like, help me out here, Marshall. Marshall, of course, had been appointed by Federalist president. I want to say, I think it was George Washington, if not John Adams. He was in there as the Supreme Court Chief Justice. Is he going to help out his buddy, the Federalist, Marbury, who's trying to get his job? No. Here's how Marshall decided the case, along with the majority. Actually, I think there was 3-0. He said, basically, we have the right to determine whether the law that created those positions was constitutional or not, because we're the Supreme Court. The law that would have given Marbury that job, we find unconstitutional. So, Marbury, sorry, you lose. Jefferson, you win. But on the bigger principle, who has more power then to interpret the Constitution and any laws passed by Congress? Supreme Court or the President? Supreme Court. And they have followed that decision year after year after year after year after year. And unless a case is specifically overturned, it's good. It's like fine wine. Well, I don't know, maybe it could turn to vinegar if it's been there long enough. But a Supreme Court decision is the decision from here on out. Let's get to some of the other key people. Earl Warren. Okay, do you see Earl Warren right near the bottom of the page there? Okay. Got judicial activism listed twice. That's silly. Earl Warren was served as the Supreme Court Justice, Chief Justice from 1954 to 1969. People think of him as, and you can write this down, as like Mr. Activism. And it's not just him, but things start becoming more judicially active during his time on the court. And again, it's not just him. Other justices are going to be starting to think kind of along the same lines. And how many justices do you need out of 9 to become more judicially active or whatever, decide the case? You need 5. Okay? He actually was appointed by a Republican, Dwight D. Eisenhower. He'd been the former governor of California. In fact, he was the guy that carried out the order during World War II to take Japanese Americans and send them off into confinement. So some people are like, whoa, this guy's going to be tough. He actually ended up becoming very judicially active. So the so-called Warren Court is the beginning of many cases where we'll see some really interesting, distinct changes and important decisions by the Supreme Court. Okay? That's when judicial activism really started kicking in. Yeah, so the Supreme Court uses the Constitution as a guide in theory. Yeah, very interesting stuff. If you don't think it's political, it's political. It's hard to touch it. It's hard to touch those guys. So who are these people? Flip over. Who are the people on the Supreme Court? Because it all comes down to them. This isn't even updated. I don't think we've had, I looked for it and I couldn't find an updated version. Because can someone tell me, where is Ruth Bader Ginsburg in this picture? Right here. She had, next to Clarence Thomas, she was the longest serving member on the court until she died late last year. And she was appointed, her replacement was Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by by President Trump. Okay? Who are the rest of these ones? Let's go through. And here's what I'm going to tell you. Okay? As I go through, you can see it's kind of like birth year. You're like, who cares what year? Oh, who cares? Why do we care? Why do we care what year they were born? Wow, that's, wow. Raise your hand if you think that the person standing up is going to die before any of you guys. Wow, that was, some of you guys are just really nice. I mean, but yeah, I mean, like, you know, older people tend to die, you know, generally. Yeah. Yeah, okay. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she was doing push-ups. She was trying to stay as healthy as possible, although she fought off cancer, I want to say like 3 or 4 times. Yeah. And she did live into her 80s. But yeah, this is why it's relevant. Write down the birth year, because I'm going to give you the birth year. So for example, here's the first one. John Roberts, he was born in 1955. Okay? What you're also going to be picking up in is the year appointed, you know. And I want to know who the president appointing them is, and usually I'll have a clue in the picture. You can look over at my wall if you're really not sure who that is appointing them. And then whether they tend to be liberal or conservative, as in more judicially active or more judicially restrained. Got that? So, 1955, how old is John Roberts going to turn this year? Old. Oh my gosh. You guys are so young. Everyone who looks older than he's old. They're older than dirt. Something like that. Yeah, 66. Yeah, he's older than me. Although there's at least 2 or 3 justices that are younger than me now on the Supreme Court. So who appointed him? Which George Bush? George Bush is not good enough. George W. Bush. Okay? He's the Chief Justice. Does he get more votes than any of the other members of the court? No. Okay? But he helps to kind of organize it a bit. So that's why he gets to sit in the center, you know, and so forth. What year was he appointed? It says right there. 2005. Okay, can't help that. All right. Is he conservative? I would have. It's interesting because I go through here. He is, but on some things, some of the folks that want more conservatives on the court are looking and they were disappointed in him. For example, last summer there was a decision on abortion, and he voted with the group on Roe versus Wade. When Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was challenged as being unconstitutional, he voted with the group that said it was constitutional. So he's a little bit, you can write this down, conservative / swing. I would say conservative to swing. So, and that's a very important position to be in, because if you're the swing voter, you get a lot of say-so as to how that decision is going to be written. They got to win you over, because if they don't, the other side is going to win the case. All right, you got that? Justice Roberts. Chief Justice Roberts. Clarence Thomas. Here we go. Born 1948. How old is he going to be this year? Old. Older. No, I know. But how many years? What's his birthday? How many candles on his cake? Let's see, 52 plus 21 is 73? 73. All right, so he's pretty old. He was appointed by, who's that guy right there, in 1991. Which George Bush? George H.W. Bush, very good. Another Republican. So that's 2 Republican ones you've seen appointed there. Okay? Clarence Thomas, clearly conservative. He is a steady conservative. It was fascinating because when he was appointed, he's the 2nd African-American member of the United States Supreme Court. He replaced the 1st African-American member of the Supreme Court, a guy by the name of Thurgood Marshall, who was previously an attorney who argued for the change in the case Brown versus Board of Education. He was a very prominent civil rights attorney and a liberal activist. And his position, the replacement, was also African-American, but somebody with a different judicial outlook. Somebody who was much more diametrically opposed, a conservative. Okay? And in fact, it was fascinating because When his appointment was taking place, Bush appointed him, but it went to where? The Senate. And the Senate had hearings, and they're like, I don't know, maybe we should vote for him or not. And then there was Anita Hill, who used to work with him. And Anita Hill said things about how Clarence Thomas had done some things at the workplace that were like sexual harassment. And it was like, oh my gosh, this is so typical political. Who believed Anita Hill? That Clarence Thomas was a sexual harasser who shouldn't be on the Supreme Court? Well, there were a lot of folks that disagreed with Clarence Thomas as far as his judicial position, so they were like, well, we don't agree with him. I mean, they didn't say that, but they're like, yeah, we believe Anita Hill. Who didn't agree with believe Anita Hill? Because it was kind of his word versus her word. People who agreed with him. He won nomination. He won the confirmation. I think the vote was like 52 or 53 to 48, 47, whatever. So he's been on the Supreme Court. His health, not bad. Some people suggested maybe he should retire while Trump was still in office, but he's like, I can hang out. I can do this. Feeling good. I'm in my 70s. Okay? I mean, it's kind of like with Bill Clinton. Who agreed? Who felt that Bill Clinton had been acting up wrongly? Who agreed with the sexual harassment thing? Right. It's like in the public area, it's kind of like, are Democrats more likely to agree that the sexual harassment took place or not? No, it's kind of like, you stick with your tribe. It's like, oh my gosh, seriously? I know, it's really kind of annoying sometimes. Actually, a lot of you guys are fair minded. You're like, look at the evidence and so forth. I know I agree with this person. I really agree with them. I think they are voting the right way, but what a jerk. I mean, that happens. And that's kind of how you're supposed to size people up in life. But when it comes to have the Senate votes, it gets a little tricky. Stephen Breyer, write his name down. Stephen Breyer, ooh. How old is he? You're like, you guys are using all these adjectives. Yeah. I mean, it's like I'm doing a quick calculation in my head. Oh my gosh, he's going to turn 83 this year? He's old. Who is he appointed by? Yeah. Liberal or conservative? Liberal. Yeah. And that's a fairly accurate guess. It used to be you weren't quite as sure as far as Republican, Democrat things, but it's really kind of separated out quite clearly between the kind of people the Republican presidents appoint and the kind of people the Democrat presidents appoint. Who's going to appoint his replacement? If you like Stephen Breyer's thing, what would you like him to do? Push-ups and hang on as long as he can? You want him to quit? Wow, that's rude. But is it wise to get somebody who's younger, closer to your age, who can be on the Supreme Court? Yeah, he wasn't going to resign when Trump was president. No way. But could he resign now and Biden's appointment be replaced? Let me see, how many Democrats are there in the United States Senate? 50 plus a tie-breaking vote, Kamala Harris. If Biden wanted to appoint somebody fairly young, fairly liberal, activist, they'd get through. What if the Republicans pick up a seat or two in the Senate? Could they defeat Biden's nomination to the Supreme Court? It's gotten that way lately. It's hardball politics. Samuel Alito, 1950, 2006, who appointed him? George W. Samuel Alito is a conservative as well. Next time, we'll spend a little bit of time talking about Sonia Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh. Oh dear, Christine Blasey Ford, we got a story there. And then Amy Coney Barrett. So we'll do those ones next time. Okay? All right, that's good.